This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 366 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I got a ton of questions this week about what's going to happen to the NFL this year, how a delay or even cancellation impacts players, how it impacts contracts. The list goes on. And guys, I have to be honest with you. For about 95% of those questions, I have no freaking idea. I don't know what's going to happen, and I can't pretend to know what's going to happen. There are so many directions that this could go in, and there are so many possibilities surrounding how the NFL handles this 2020 season and beyond. It wouldn't be fair for me to sit on this show and give you information and opinions that are complete guesses. That's not how I roll. All I can offer up is what I know from a football perspective and how it relates to performance. We know players need reps to get better, especially at positions like wide receiver and tight end. So adjust accordingly. I'd care less about a running back not getting training camp reps than I would a wide receiver or a tight end, where it's more difficult to transition to the pros. Maybe the answer to your specific question is to not devalue young or rookie running backs, but maybe be a little bit less bullish on the pass catchers. Maybe that's all I need to say. But when it comes to whether or not the season's going to happen, how a canceled season impacts contracts, what it means for the 2021 NFL draft, I don't know. Like a lot of things in life right now, there are just loads and loads of unknowns. Now, before getting into the questions this week, let's talk some esports. Though the majority of the sports world is still a standstill, esports continues its rise to prominence. For just $4, enter FanDuel's $30,000 Saturday League of Legends Nexus and compete for your share of the $30,000 prize pool, including a $5,000 first place prize. Caps, Bang, Perks, and so many more will be looking to establish themselves as the best League of Legends players in the world, and you can show your support by building a team around them. For more details, visit www.fanduel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. This first question's an email. It says, "Hey JJ, hope you're staying safe." Thanks, I hope you are too. As someone who prospects primarily through data, how do you evaluate someone like Brandon Ayuk who started out at JUCO? We don't have any data for 2 really important years, and naturally, his breakout age can't be that great. He also played with N'Keal Harry as a junior, so we really only have 1 year of reliable data. Is it fair to hold a small sample size against Ayuk when you're evaluating him? Does his situation compare to any other players in recent years? Thanks, Brian. So I think it's a little unfair to say that we only have 1 year of reliable data on Brandon Ayuk. We have 4 years of reliable data. It's just that he was only productive in one of those seasons. There are plenty of wide receivers who play behind or play with professional wide receivers, and they have just 1 year of good production as a result. But we don't say that they only have 1 reliable year of data. We say that they broke out late and they weren't able to overcome the talent on their own team. I don't see why that's any different for Ayuk, and it's why his profile is concerning. Now, I think he can be fine, but from what I've read and what I understand, he didn't go to JUCO for something like academic issues or anything. He did it because coming out of high school, he played a little bit of defense, or at least that's what I've read, and he wasn't a highly recruited player. Then he does well in JUCO, then he goes to Arizona State, isn't able to produce significantly in year 1, and then really breaks out during his second year there. That 1 year of data is important, sure. But because of his path, we shouldn't ignore everything outside that year. You have to ask why he couldn't compete with N'Keal Harry. You have to ask why he wasn't able to play at a bigger school until he was a junior. And analytically, you have to ding a player like that because you'd much rather have a wide receiver who breaks out early and is good throughout the entire process than one who's just good at the end. And this isn't me saying that Ayuk is some scrub. You guys can check my rankings. I don't think he's terrible. I just think there's concerns to his profile, and those concerns aren't there for others. This next question is from @James_AG1. If you could know the 2020 outcome for one running back, wide receiver, and tight end, who would you pick? I think this is a great question. And I think the answer to this is basically who's got the most ambiguity while also being a higher round pick, and someone who would give us information about other players in his offense. So I'm thinking a player with a wide range of outcomes, likely in an offense with a lot of usable fantasy pieces that we might be able to get more information on those players, and someone who's a higher round pick. So using that criteria, I think the answer might be Austin Ekeler. That way we could get a general idea of both pass catching and rushing, and maybe it would help us understand how that backfield ends up being split and the type of target share that would be there for the other pass catchers in the offense. So that's my choice for this question, but I would love to hear what you guys think too. This next question says, hey JJ, love the show, don't say thanks. Okay, I won't. You had Sig on last week and talked about a wide receiver by committee approach that some teams might take in the future. Would a situation like that be good for fantasy football and analytics or bad? Would it give an advantage to people who did more research? Thanks. So I'd argue the whole wide receiver by committee thing is already happening. The idea behind it is that wide receivers have very particular jobs that teams can use to exploit matchups. So we'll sometimes see games for the Rams, for example, where Cooper Kupp might go off, but then the next week it's Robert Woods because they're exploiting a matchup. I definitely think that this gives the researchers a bigger advantage. The game isn't just this guy gets 10 targets every game, you've got to use him. Instead, you're digging more into individual matchups to exploit what that team might do. Now, obviously, that assumes rational coaching and that you have to have all the right information. We don't always have that information. But the more the ball gets distributed around an offense, the more research we'll have to do to predict things correctly. This next question says, can Joe Mixon finish as overall RB1? So let's talk about Joe Mixon. I've seen some people view Mixon as a locked-in RB1 this year, and I thought I'd be in the same boat, but my projections didn't like him as much as I thought that they would. I think a lot of Mixon's season is going to come down to his receiving work. In 2019, the Bengals had the third lowest target share to running backs, and Mixon ranked 34th at the running back position in target share. I have Mixon projected for a higher target share in 2020, but it's not so significantly higher to the point where he's in a tier with elite pass catchers, elite pass catching running backs, because you still have to weigh the negatives in a projection. The question here, though, is can Joe Mixon finish as the overall RB1? And I guess that he can, technically. I don't think the chances are super high, but he can. With guys like Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, the list goes on, it's unlikely that Joe Mixon will be the RB1. But in order for him to ascend and really become a higher-end RB1 in fantasy, he absolutely needs that pass-catching component. That's the one piece that's bringing him down, and hopefully Joe Burrow can help. This next question says, hey JJ, hope all is well. Thanks, you too. What do you make of the Bills receivers right now with Diggs? Is he the clear-cut number one there? I was just curious what your model thought of Diggs and Brown being together, because for me at least, they have pretty comparable play styles. It also seems that early rankings have Diggs significantly higher than Brown, about 3 to 4 rounds ahead. Whereas I don't understand that large of a discrepancy. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks, Jimmy D. Yeah, so I talked a little bit about Diggs in the free agency podcast that I did last month, but I hate the landing spot. It's really, really hard to sell that landing spot as anything good. Not only is Buffalo a pretty run-heavy team with a neutral script pass-to-rush attempt ratio that's ranked no higher than 20th in the past 2 years with Josh Allen, but like you said, they've got some weapons there. Cole Beasley and John Brown aren't going away. Dawson Knox is a nice young tight end. And then on top of that, Diggs has never been a player throughout his career who's demanded a crazy high target share. This is why I had him as a sell candidate earlier in the offseason. The idea of Stefon Diggs always seemed better than the performance of Stefon Diggs. He's a really good wide receiver. I think he's an awesome wide receiver. But he only hit a 25% target share once over his 5-year career. So you can't assume he sees that type of target share in Buffalo. I do think he's a better bet to see more targets than John Brown, like the question is asking, since Brown can be a really effective field stretcher. I bet that Brown sees more down the field targets than Stefon Diggs this year, even though Diggs can do the same thing. They both work well with Josh Allen at the end of the day. But I think this is just a situation to generally avoid in fantasy football. I guess I'd probably be higher on Brown versus his ADP than Diggs, just given the cost. But the real winner here, you guys, and the guy to buy into in this offense, Josh Allen. This next question is from @Tubaka. What under-the-radar rookie running backs are you keeping an eye on? Yeah, I really like this rookie running back class. I think Eno Benjamin has the most intriguing production profile of a guy who's going to go outside the top group, but I keep falling more and more in love with Darrington Evans as a player. He reminds me of Nyheim Hines, but imagine Nyheim Hines with more potential for early down work. He could just be more dynamic. So those are the two who popped into my head with this question. I really like this running back class, and I think that the guys in it are going to make an impact in the NFL. This next question says, are running back handcuffs more worthwhile in Dynasty? Or are they less valuable because the landscape is ever changing? Or some other answer? Love the show. Thanks. So handcuffing in redraft is tough to do for a lot of reasons. I did a study on this a while back, and basically one reason is that we don't always accurately predict who that handcuff is going to be. We also don't realize that injuries aren't happening to top backs in weeks 1 or 2. It's usually way later in the season, meaning you're holding on to a relatively worthless asset for a long period of time before that asset even has a chance. And then even when handcuffs get a chance, though there have been some successes that get all the love and fame, tons and tons of handcuffs fail. There's a bias that people have when looking at running back handcuffs. In Dynasty, though, because rosters are so much bigger, the holding on to the handcuff thing isn't that big of a deal. So handcuffing is easier and a more meaningful thing to do. And then there could be some instances where the running back actually does step into the starting role if the other running back leaves, giving that player more value. Although that is kind of rare. So are they worthwhile? I think it's fine to get handcuffs in Dynasty. And not just for running backs that you have on your roster, but running backs on other teams' rosters. Most, if not all, handcuffs should be rostered in most Dynasty leagues. But I don't think it's completely necessary, per se. You still run into the same issues that you'd run into in redraft leagues, like the handcuff not producing when he's called upon, or us not knowing exactly who that handcuff is. This last question is from @thegoose5000. Ekeler and Drake are my main running backs. Are these sell candidates due to their value spikes, or do I use their fantasy points to win games? So I don't want to frame this answer as you absolutely should sell Kenyan Drake or you absolutely should sell Austin Ekeler. I don't necessarily feel that way. But I do think that I'm lower on both of them versus where people are drafting them in startups, even though I think both players are very, very good. Now with Ekeler, I actually got another question this week that relates to this that says, I'm hearing a lot about how Ekeler's receiving touchdown rate will regress, but as the lead back, wouldn't his rushing touchdown opportunity necessarily see a boost? He only had 3 rushing touchdowns last year. Should we be accounting for greater opportunity for Ekeler to score on the ground as the lead back for the Chargers? Now, I think this question is why I'm lower on Austin Ekeler than the consensus is, which is why I wanted to bring it up. I don't really understand why the assumption is that Austin Ekeler is going to be a workhorse. I'm not saying it's not possible. You guys know that I think in terms of probability. But before Melvin Gordon came back last year, Ekeler was seeing about 64% of the team's running back rushes. There were 14 running backs who hit that mark last year. And when you include prorated rates, because not all running backs played 16 games, you've got even more running backs hitting that mark. So Ekeler did see a lot more of the team's running back rushes without Melvin Gordon. That's not what I'm saying. I agree there. I'm just noting that his upside on the ground isn't like Nick Chubb. So that's one reason to not go nuts with his rushing touchdown projection, even if he should see some positive regression. This is also under the assumption that the Chargers don't draft a running back. They've got pick 37 and 71 in the draft, which could easily go to that position. Maybe they don't. That would be awesome for Austin Ekeler, but that's still part of the range of outcomes right now. And then on top of that, to me, the problem with Ekeler isn't necessarily touchdown related. It's his receiving production. He's a really good receiving back. But the way they're set right now at quarterback, the team isn't likely going to be very pass heavy moving forward in the short term. I've mentioned this before on the show, but the Chargers have been fairly pass heavy over the last few years, including last year when they ranked second in the NFL in neutral script pass to rush ratio. And like I've also talked about on the show, Phillip Rivers has really targeted his running backs at a high rate over the last decade. Some of that is due to having good pass catching personnel, but we shouldn't ignore the quarterback change and how that straight up is going to affect Austin Ekeler. I still think he's a really good player and fantasy asset. I just think there are enough red flags surrounding him where sure, he's got a decent sized ceiling if things break his way, but he also has a lot of downside if they do draft a running back like Cam Akers. And then they do go more run heavy and don't allow Ekeler to thrive as a pass catching back. So that's my take on Ekeler. I think he's a fringe RB1 in Dynasty, but for example, I took Leonard Fournette over him in a recent Dynasty startup because there just seems to be a little bit more of a short-term safety net there. Now, regarding Kenyan Drake, I think there's concern over Cliff Kingsbury's comments about deploying 3 running backs throughout the regular season. That's what he said recently. And we don't know what's going to happen after this year. At least you do have a more secured future with Austin Ekeler in terms of a contract. Though I do think that the Cardinals are going to get something longer term done with Kenyan Drake. And I should note too that I do think that Drake has mid-range RB1 upside this year. But his projection isn't giving him automatic RB1 production. Not at least right now. So you've got 2 different situations where I can make an argument either way. I guess I'd say I'm slightly lower than the market on both guys, but if you're trying to win in 2020, it's hard for me to say that selling them would be a good idea. Unless you're selling them for a young back who's locked into a workload. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And by the way, guys, I've got a pretty fun announcement. Next week for the draft, I'll be doing a live stream with my colleagues Jim Sonis and Brandon Gadula on FanDuel's YouTube channel. The plan is to just talk through the picks, talk through their impact, but more importantly, I'll provide some real-time projections as well. So when Jerry Jeudy's drafted, I'll be able to plug it into my system and give you guys a projection right away. Since there's going to be a ton of fantasy impact on day 2, we're actually planning on streaming both Thursday and Friday next week. It should be a lot of fun, and I would love it if you guys came and watched and listened. The link is youtube.com/FanDuel videos, so go there, subscribe, and don't miss it. But thanks everyone, I hope that you're all staying safe, and I'll talk to you on Monday.